To get started, let's create our HTML file, which we'll call index.html. Inside our HTML file, let's create our boilerplate code. Then we'll change the title to Palindrome Checker. Now, in the body of our HTML, we'll create a div with a class name container, and inside our container div, we'll create a div with a class name Palindrome Checker. Inside our Palindrome Checker div, we'll have a header, and inside our header will be an h1 tag with a p tag. For the h1, we want to have our heading as Palindrome Checker. And inside our p tag, what we'll simply do is that we will define what a palindrome is. So a palindrome is simply a word or phrase that reads the same way, either forwards or backward. Good. So having defined what a palindrome is, right beneath our header tag, we'll create a div with a class name input box. And inside our input box, we'll have an input element with a class name text box. That's where we'll be putting our text. Also, we would have a button which would have the class name check button. This button is what we would use to check if our phrase or word is a palindrome. Good. So let's just edit the styling a little bit so that it will look much better and readable. Just like that. Great. Finally, let's for our input box, inside the input, let's pass in the placeholder attribute, which would have enter a phrase. Let's make it enter a word or a phrase. Good. Just like that. Now, for the button text, let's pass in check palindrome. And the last element in our HTML file will be our feedback class. This is going to be a p tag with a class name feedback. For the meantime, let's pass in the text. This is a palindrome. We would later on use JavaScript to update the text in our feedback class. Now, let's view our HTML file in the browser using Live Server. Beautiful. Our index.html file has been opened up in our browser successfully. So this doesn't look the best yet. So let's style it with CSS. And before we do that, let's split our screen between the browser and our text editor so that we can see exactly what we are doing. Let's go ahead to create our styles.css file. Having created our styles.css file, now let's link it to our index.html file. Right beneath the title, we want to create a link tag, and for the href, we'll pass in styles.css. So our CSS has been successfully linked to our HTML file. As always, the first thing we would do with this project is to give some universal stylings. And the first thing we'll do is to set every margin to 0. Then we want every default padding also to be 0. We'll also set the box sizing property to border box. Great. And for this project, we'll use the font family of Verdana. Just like that. So we can see that our text is much more prettier now. Moving on, we want to style our container class. And with the container class, what we want to do is that we want it to fill the whole screen, right? We want it to actually have a width of 100%. So let's do that quickly. A width of 100% and a height of 100 viewport height. That will make it have the height of the whole screen. So in order to see our box, our container div, let's give it a background color of say red. We'll change this later on, but we just want to see what it does. Great. So the very next thing we want to do with our container class is that we want to center everything in our container class, and to do this we'll simply use the Flexbox property. We'll set the display to flex and the align items to center. Also the justify content will also be center. This would center everything in our box successfully. So let's look at it in the browser. Beautiful, just like that. Now let's change the background color to a much beautiful color. And for this project, our background color is going to be sort of a purple color. It starts with AA57CC. Good, just like that. So we have this beautiful purple color for our background. Next thing we want to style would be our Palindrome checker class right in our HTML file. So let's take a look at it so that we can see what's inside. We want to style this particular class, right? This box that holds everything together. Now, the very first thing that we should do here, let's set the background color. Let's set it to white, and we'll be using the hex code FFF, just like that. And we also want to give it a max width of 500 pixels. That is, we don't want the width to grow beyond 500 pixels. Having set the max width property, let's now make this look better. We can see that our text is too close to the borders of our Palindrome checker class. So to separate the content, the inner content from the borders, we are going to use the padding property. And our first value is going to be 20 pixels, which will be for our top and down. And then we'll set 15 pixels for the left and right. Also, let's round the corners of our box a little bit by using the border radius property. And for the border radius property, we'll use 7 pixels, and I think that's just fine. Having styled our Palindrome checker class, let's do something about the H1. We can see that the H1 is too close to this part, right? This don't look too good. So let's quickly do that. And we'll also change the font family, the font size. So we'll simply select it with our selectors, and then let's set the font size to 1.1 rem. Again, the next thing we want to style is our H1 text. Let's change the font size and the font weight. So to do that, we'll select it with a selector, Palindrome checker, then H1. We want to change the font size to 1.1 rem. Good. Then let's give it a font weight of about, I think 800 will be good. Yeah, it's just fine. 800 is good. 800 is good. So that looks a little beautiful, much more beautiful. Let's then style our p tag, right? So we want to style our Palindrome checker with the p tag. More specifically, we want to style this one. So if you check in our HTML file, we can see that we have 2 p tags here, right? So we need to be a little more specific. So we want the p tag inside the header element. So let's bring header here. And for that p tag, the first thing we want to do is we want to set the font size to around 1 rem. 1 rem. Having specified the font size, now let's set the margin to 16 pixels for the top and bottom. We want to separate it from our H1, and then we'll give it 0 to remove the side. Good, just like that. We want that away. We don't want that over there. So I think this is beginning to look good. Now let's change the color a little bit. We don't want it too dark, so we'll use the color 474747. That's a little bit grayish, right? So I think that's looking good now. Now we can then move on to style our input box. Let's style our input blocks. Good. So for our input box, the very first element we want to style is the input. And for the input, we want it to have a width of 100%. And we don't want the outline. Now, when we click here, you can see an outline just when we are about to enter a text. We don't want that outline. So we set the outline to none, right? And we'll give it a border of 1 pixel solid, and our color is going to be 999, just like that. Again, let's give it a height of about 48 pixels to see how it looks. I think that works. That's looking good. That's looking beautiful. Having done that, we want to give it a padding. Now, if we begin typing something, we realize that our text is too close to the border. So let's give it some paddings, and we'll give it a padding of 8 pixels. 8 pixels. That will then separate the text from the line, making it much more easier to read. Let's move on to style the focus state of our input. So our input box, input, and when we focus, what we want to do is that we want to give it a box shadow. Let's give it a box shadow of, on the X, we want to have 4 pixels, on the Y, 8 pixels, and our blur will be 16 pixels. Now for the color, we'll use the RGBA, we'll do a black, and we'll give it an alpha value of 0.2, right? So when we are just about to enter, you see that shadow right beneath the input element over there, which makes it more beautiful in my opinion. Yep, I think it's beginning to look good. Moving on, we don't have to style our button. This button doesn't look too good. So let's style our button. We want to have input box, and we select our button. The very first thing we want to do is we want to give it a width of 50%. Now, because it has a width, it means our margin property can work on it. We can use the auto on it, margin auto on it, which would center it automatically. So we'll give the top and bottom 8 pixels, and we'll give the horizontal auto. I think that should center it very well. Let's also give it a height. Let's give it a height. Why is this not working? Let's give it a height. Let's give it a height of 32 pixels. 32 pixels. Good. This should work. Let's move on to style our button. So for the button, we'll select it with our input box class, and we'll call the button. Inside our button, we want to give it a width of 50%, and we'll give it a height of 32 pixels. Now, let's set the background color. We'll use the same background color we have for our container. So that's beginning to look good. Now, let's set the color of the text to white. So we use FFF, Continuing, we don't want this outline here, so we set the outline to none. Good. And having done that, let's give it a border also of none. That will make the text look good immediately. For our button class, we want to change the display. Buttons are usually inline elements, but in this project, what we would do is to change the display to block, and we would give it a margin of top to be 8 pixels, top and bottom 8 pixels, and for the horizontal axis, we want it to be auto. Now, if we don't do this display block property, what will happen is that our margin won't work. And in order to solve that, we might have to include another div in our input box, but we don't want to do that. We want to simplify our HTML, so we'll simply display the button element as a block. Now, when we hover upon our button, we want the cursor to be pointer. Again, let's round the corners of our button a little bit. So we'll use the border radius property and we'll give it 5 pixels. 5 pixels. Good. I think it's beginning to look good and everything is coming together. Now, we don't want the user to be able to, we want to set this background opacity to initially to be lighter, right? So let's set the opacity to say 0.7, and then until the user has inputted the text in our input box or in our text input, then this would become opacity of 1, but we'll do that with JavaScript later. Having styled our button class, the very next thing we want to do is to style our feedback paragraph. Now, for our feedback paragraph, we want to reduce the size. This text is too big, it doesn't look too good. So let's set the font size to 12 pixels. And we would set the text align property to center. This would automatically center the text in our paragraph in the middle. The reason why this works so well is because the paragraph tag is a box, is a block element, which means it automatically takes the full width of its container. Hence, when we use the text align property, it will center the text in the paragraph in relation to the outer box. I hope that was a good explanation and why it works so well. You can leave in the comments down below. If you didn't understand that, I might just explain it better. Again, for our HTML, we wanted to introduce a span element in the feedback class. The reason being that we'll use JavaScript to display to the user whether this word or phrase they pass in is a palindrome or not. So let's make sure to include that in our code. Finally, we are going to style that feedback class in our CSS. And what we will do is simply set the color to our container background color, just like that. I think this looks beautiful. Let's view it in full screen again. And boom, just like that. I think it's looking good.